I'm Garth Clark. I'm a very active writer in the field. With my partner Mark Del Vecchio, I ran the Garth Clark Gallery. At one stage we were in Los Angeles, Kansas City, New York, and London. A terrible idea as it turned out. We just had to split the profits between 4 overheads. But we became the top gallery internationally for ceramic art, and we showed artists on all 4 continents. In all, we did about 800 to 900 exhibitions in 30 years, and that wasn't just in the galleries. We also did exhibitions for other galleries. We did exhibitions for museums in Europe and here. So it had a fairly major impact on where the medium went. And indeed, we met at the Museum of Craft, if that's its correct title. We think of it as the egg and the eye, of course. So that was 1981 that we first met. We'd just opened our gallery in Los Angeles, opposite the LA County Museum. The reason I was attracted to clay, I think, and I've got really no idea because I believe that I was kidnapped by Earth Mother, but living in South Africa, I watched Zulu and Xhosa potters coiling and making pots. And, I was fairly young, and watching the plasticity, the beautiful forms that came up, I think that was the beginning. And I became a critic of ceramics fairly early. When I was 18, a friend gave me an eraser. And what the eraser did was it removed low fire gold off glazed surfaces. So I was living in Durban at the time, and I would go into the department stores. And if I found one of their vases to be too vulgar, I would quietly erase enough gold until it looked elegant again. So, I don't know whether that was vandalism or criticism, but artists say there's no difference. I came to Santa Fe many years before, and I looked at it and I thought, oh, this is a kind of artificial Western set, and I didn't get into the nature of what it is. So I can be quite arbitrary, and I sort of just wrote it off. I didn't think it was a place I wanted to be. But in the latter years of the gallery, we showed Diego and Virgil and Christine, and we would come here to work with them. And, by the time you come here 3 times, the city's got you. And also, Virgil, Diego, Christine brought us into their family, which was a very exciting thing. So we had a wonderful introduction here. We closed the gallery in 2008 because we felt we had done what we should do, and we should open the field to the fine arts, which is exactly what happened. But we wanted a third act. You don't get third acts in New York. You just get long continuations of whichever act you're in. So we wanted a very different life from that point on. And we got it here. I had no second thoughts, not even a minute or two. I was already in love with Santa Fe. And my field is not Native American pottery. I had to learn the history of it because in representing 3 native potters, I had to know what I was doing. And the history is about 1,500 years old. It's fairly straightforward. There was never a wheel, there was never glazes. The same materials were used, the same techniques were used throughout that period. But it was fascinating. And so when we got here, we didn't become specialists in native pottery. But what it did do is it gave a kind of spiritual edge to what we did. When you go to the pueblos and when you walk out in the countryside, every step you're kicking up shards. Some of those shards are 900 years old, 1,000 years old. And so for somebody who loves ceramics, this was almost like moving into a church. When we opened the gallery in Los Angeles, the sort of division between ceramics and the art world was pretty intense. And they didn't just seem to dislike the form, but they seemed to dislike the material. In fact, when we got to New York, we made friends with some of the pioneering art dealers there, and they said to us, "You know what we call ceramics, don't you?" We said, "No." And they said, "Terra worthless, because we just can't sell it. Nobody wants to buy it. Even if it's a piece by Miro, it is difficult to sell." So that was sort of our entry point. From the beginning, we wanted to change that. Now, we didn't think that all ceramics belonged in fine art, but there was a group that did. So we worked on that for 30 years, and with considerable success towards the end. So what we saw in the arc of ceramics was that it began very much rooted to the crafts world. I would say 90% of it still is, although the difference now is the craft world is migrating to the design world. For instance, the very top art fair to be in is Design Miami. That is the pinnacle for people working in ceramics, what we would call in those days studio parties, and I suppose they still are. But step by step, we began to expand it. And in New York, we began to introduce fine artists and mix them with artists who were not yet part of that world. And that was quite successful. We were worried that it would create an upstairs and a downstairs community, with obviously the ceramists being downstairs. Didn't do that at all. And when we started moving in this direction, a couple of ladies came into the gallery and they were walking around and they said, "Oh, I get this. This is a ceramics gallery that is all about art." And Mark and I gave each other high fives because that's exactly what we wanted. So in 2008, we closed the gallery, partly because we felt that we needed to get out of the way, that things were changing, and the way we worked and what we represented was something that needed to move on into the fine art world or the design world. And we left quite a vacuum, and that vacuum got filled by many of the top galleries, some of the decorative arts galleries, craft galleries, and so began to move out. What has happened since is that the fine arts have taken on, like Ron Nagel and Ken Price. They've introduced their own artists, like Sterling Ruby, who actually has tremendous knowledge of ceramics, but only recently began to make it, and other artists from their stable who were not necessarily specialists in the field, but they added the material to their repertoire of mediums. And then there was the movement into, design, which was quite powerful and still is. And other things began to happen. There were artists that didn't work in clay, but their theme was ceramics. So subject-wise, they were dealing with the same thing, just not in our medium. Michael Eden is a good example. He's a British artist, and he does the most extraordinary takeoffs of Sèvres and Old English pottery, but he prints them out in nylon. So the field expanded not just into new people working with it, but new approaches to it outside simply clay itself. And then clay itself is having an extraordinary time. Clay was probably the first sculptural material ever. We have few references we have few references to this because, of course, if you take clay that has been dried in the sun and it rains, it's gone. So it's only when we began firing, which was up to about 20,000 years ago, that we had a record. But this has become the favorite medium for sculptors today. And Urs Fischer, a whole group of contemporary artists now work in unfired clay. And they create these huge things. Villar Rojas is another one who's really absolutely brilliant in what he does. And it attracts them because clay is cheap and you can work large with it. And Rojas was asked, why do you work in unfired clay? And his answer was, because it gives me instant ruin. So that's what they like. Mark Manders, who is Holland's top sculptor, loves clay. But of course, if you're going to work in it unfired, you can't sell that product because it's going to come apart. It's not going to survive. So what they've done now is develop the most extraordinary conversions into bronze. And it's quite disturbing because you walk up to one of these pieces and you think, oh, this is clay. Now, I mean, I know clay, so I think it's an unfired piece. You walk up to it, you knock on it and it goes clang, clang, it's not clay. They have managed to produce patinas which either give you the look of dry clay or the look of damp clay. They managed to keep each little crack and each little movement on the surface. It's really mind-boggling. And I don't mind that at all. I think that's another extension of ceramics because whether it is clay or not, anybody looking at it is seeing clay. So it's another extension of what's happened in our field. So if you take all of that, ceramics has gone on a tear, both vertically and horizontally. This is the most golden age we've ever had for our medium. No boundaries. It's really exciting. André Malraux, who was a minister of culture in France and also an art thief apparently, said that the difference between craft and art is this. Anybody who reproduces what they inherit, anyone who reproduces what they inherit is a craftsman. Anybody who transforms what they inherit is an artist. And over the years, for me it's been 50 years, it's the one definition that really still holds up. And so that divides the two very easily for me. I don't believe that anything made by man is necessarily art. And if you want to confirm that view, go to an average craft fair and you will understand that I'm right on the money. I met Diego Romero, I suppose, close to the end of us closing New York, probably 2006, 2005. But I'd known his work for a long, long time. And we'd tried very unsuccessfully through the years to have an exhibition of his. Diego is a much calmer lad today than he was in those days. The Chongo brothers were known as the wildest party animals in the whole of New Mexico. Well, now you have to understand, to achieve that in New Mexico is an extraordinary achievement. And then he began to settle down and we began to work with him. As I say, I've been a fan of his work for a long, long time. And the first person to mention his work to me was Adrian Sachs. Now, Diego might have told you about his relationship with Adrian and how it changed his art. I was fascinated by it because, again, being a little myopic, I really dealt with, I suppose, European and American pottery, and I saw native pottery as an entirely different entity. In fact, I saw it as the kind of pottery that was being made in North Carolina, the traditional salt glaze and alkaline glaze work. It came from a tradition, it was still traditional, and so in my practice, which was contemporary, I never took it that seriously. It wasn't my field. And then Virgil approached us for an exhibition, and I began to realize that while I was still right about a lot of the work, there were a group of artists coming up that really had to be taken seriously. They were contemporary artists. We had no interest in representing the romance, guilt, and shame of the native pottery collectors. The artists had to meet the standards of other contemporary art. His work, or should I say Diego's work, was interesting because of its layering. There was the influence from Cochiti. There was the influence from his absolute insane pursuit of comic books. There was influence from Mimbres. And the Mimbres was very important because the Mimbres were the only native potters, probably before the 20th century, who did figurative work. And there was a reason for that because in tribal cultures, potters are considered dangerous. It would be nice if they were considered dangerous today, but they were considered dangerous because they were working with Earth Mother. And so there were all kinds of rules. A potter was not allowed to step backwards over a pot. They were not allowed to make pots when they were menstruating. They were not allowed to make pots when they had evil thoughts about individuals. So because of that, they didn't do figures, because then people would wonder who that figure was and whether this was casting a spell or going to cause them problems. The Mimbres that we know very little about, they dispersed around about 1100, 1200, were the only ones that did figures, and they are probably in the top 10% of all pottery ever made. Their draftsmanship is extraordinary. They're painting on a curving bowl, much the same as Diego does. There's a close relationship between the two. And they'll paint a scene which, when you look at it, is flat. So they're changing the line to create an illusion of flatness. That's a very sophisticated act of draftsmanship. So the line doesn't curve into the bowl, it stands out as a flat field. And it's really remarkable work. So you see that coming into his work. Then he had a passion for Greek pottery, early Greek pottery, the runners, from round about beginning of the 20th century. So he took all of that and he so skillfully layered the one onto the other. Sometimes one of the influences is strong. Sometimes it's a pastiche where you can't really tell where this is coming from. His tradition from Cochiti, of course, is Cochiti started doing figures round about 1900. And what got them going was circuses. The circuses would come to town and they would see Siamese twins. They would see ladies with beards. They would see all these extraordinary sideshows. And so they started making fairly bizarre figures inspired by the circus folk. Interesting, there was another development in the 60s when the place was overrun with hippies, and they started making hippie figures. But either way, that pueblo was very important in the development of figurative sculpture within the native community. Then we started to work with them probably more directly when we got to Santa Fe. We didn't intend to work with anybody once we got here, but we did. We arranged shows at different galleries in town, but I think the high point was when we organized an exhibition for him in Paris. And it was really wonderful to see how the content of his work had a universal appeal, because here the references were clearly American folk art and various other things that he put into it. So we could recognize that easily. Once you took it to Paris, they didn't necessarily see the layering. They didn't take it apart. And even if they did, they wouldn't have recognized some of the influences from here. But the content, the conflict, the emotion that he put into his work crossed over wonderfully. And I really enjoyed spending time in the gallery and watching people respond to it. We did have one problem though, and that is a piece was sold to the Museum of Decorative Art in Paris. And we got a letter from their registrar, and she said, this piece was purchased in error because we don't collect works that are from an anonymous tribal source. And obviously, this has been made by a group of people, and I'm blanking on the name. How does he sign his parts again? Chongo, yeah. And she said, we can't buy this piece because it is made by a group of people called Chongo, and it's just a tribal work. We only collect work which is individual, made by one person. So I had to contact them and tell them there was no such thing as a Chongo tribe, and explain to them why he used this. And it's an interesting title. It means bun, with the hairs turned into a bun, but also it's very close to a Spanish word that means rat. So it's a strange name to take on. It's a little provocative, and but it gives a kind of another sense to it, because you are not dealing directly with the ego of Diego. His name is not there. We know he's the maker, but there's a sort of distance he places by using that name. We started working with Diego because he was one of a relatively small group amongst the native parties who was making contemporary art. The Indian component is not, unimportant within the whole thing, but through bringing other influences in, and not just bringing them in, but bringing them in with such sophistication, he was taking Indian pottery into a new realm. And in some ways, it doesn't matter that it's Indian pottery. If one's Italian or French or, Irish, Spanish, it doesn't matter. In the contemporary world, we don't do that. We don't put everybody into their groups. And so, to me, I wasn't impressed by the fact that it was native pottery. Although I was impressed by how far he had taken it, I was impressed because it was simply contemporary art. And that's why we showed him. He was able to bring so many cultural references into what he did. As I say, all the way from the Greeks. And it also caused you to look at Indian pottery in a completely different way. So he and a small group of artists really pushed things forward. And the thing today is that the top three at that time, Diego, Virgil, and Christine McHorse, are pretty much still the top three today. There's Susan Falwell, a few others that belong to this list as well. But they led the field 20 years ago, and they're still doing so. As other native artists try and play catch up with them, but these guys still rule. And we also did a show in Holland with them at the Stedelijk Museum in Hertogenbosch. It was called Free Spirit. The book that I wrote for it was somewhat provocative, and Charles King, who's an absolutely wonderful dealer in native pottery, said, "I don't think you should come back to Santa Fe without a bodyguard." Because what we did in the book was show some of the mythologies that exist within this field. And so if you go into a shop that is selling native pottery, they will bring out a seed bowl. Well, because the clays here are not really that great and the forms are not that diverse, for the collectors, the most important thing is a painted surface and how beautifully the pattern is done or whatever. So they would bring out these pots and they would tell people, and I've listened to this, that there's this little hole and they would push the seeds in and then they would go out, turn this upside down, sort of shake it out one seed at a time. Well, the way these worked was it was a big open bowl and they stuck their hand in and they grabbed a lot of seed and they threw it. The reason why it closed up was because that gave them more space to paint on, which increased the value of the pieces. And the other thing to take into account is that by 1880, once there was more sort of European and American industrial goods coming here, the native population pretty much stopped using their own wares. They were not used in their life. They made them now almost exclusively to sell to tourists. You can imagine how excited they were when they got their first enamel tin bowl and they could drop it and it wouldn't break. So from that point on, it becomes pottery for tourists. And the collectors set all kinds of rules. They didn't like asymmetrical form. If there was black outline for a pattern, they didn't want the color to cross over the line. They didn't like fire clouds. And fire clouds are the marks that come from the firing. And, you know, like a black cloud that not covers the piece, but will certainly cover part of the piece. And then they had to get smaller because they had to take these back home with the train. And so it really changed the whole nature of things. And so even today, what you hear going on in the galleries and shops is a lot of mythology. And some of the most successful forms, like the marriage vase, that was designed by a trader. It's also called the wedding vase, and he couldn't sell it. But then he called it the wedding vase, and it had this little frisson of sex about it, and suddenly became one of the most favorite forms for the collectors in the field. So if you look back on it, it's a very strange artificial world in which the pottery lives today. So when you have Diego stepping out of tradition, it's not quite the same as what happened to Indian pottery. It's not quite the same as to what happened to Indian pottery, but it's similar. He's now working for a different audience entirely. And some of the collectors of traditional parts would buy his work, but mostly his work started to sell to contemporary art collectors, and some very major ones at that. The same-sex series developed because he was married to a woman who had AIDS. And it was interesting, when we were in Paris, the audience was there for the opening, and Diego began his talk by saying, "I wonder if you know what it's like to live with somebody, to be married with somebody who has AIDS." And he began to talk about it in a very deep and revealing manner. This was very typical of Diego. He doesn't hold back. He's extraordinarily honest, not just about things around him, but his own strengths and failures. And that audience was almost in tears by the end of the talk. So he is very open about it. And that began the Safe Sex series, which I absolutely love. It's the graphic way in which he portrayed it was wonderful. It was, I suppose some people might think, pornographic, but then it was done in a cartoon manner, which, say he was a realist, it would have been much more provocative. But by giving it a cartoon edge, it was much more acceptable. Although we have one big bowl with a love glove on it, and you can work out what that is, and we still see sort of people pause and blink when they come to that subject. And again, this is what makes him so different to everybody in the field, is that he will go into taboo areas, and also he goes into taboo areas as far as his pueblo is concerned, because the pueblos are run by a group of elders. The elders delineate which part of their cultural life can be shown to outsiders and which can't. And he got into fairly serious trouble with the film that he did. And he had the buffalo spirit sort of dancing in the background, wasn't in the foreground, was just in the background. And he got called in and really spoken to about that, because it was not allowed for him to show the buffalo spirit in any place except within the pueblo. So I'm not sure how much he respects, or I'm sure he respects, but I don't know how much he follows of that. So when he's doing work, he can upset everybody, which is what I like about it. I base my career on that. And he will make both his own people uncomfortable with what he reveals, and then he will make the Westerners in America very uncomfortable too. On the surface, it's pretty drawing, and then when you get into the content, there's very often teeth. And he's also very critical of his own community. Issues like alcoholism, for instance, which there's a 60% rate of alcoholism in the Native community, for the simple reason that their bodies cannot metabolize alcohol. So it enters as a kind of toxin and becomes immediately something they grow dependent upon. So he deals with young Native men who are taking on a Western lifestyle, their cars, their new homes. If you look at his work over the years, it's ranged through so many subjects. And I would like to see his market grow even bigger. And I've been speaking to a museum that shall remain nameless, and they're very interested now in doing a retrospective. And I think that will be a little mind-blowing. The thing to remember about him, though, is he is essentially a draftsman. If you look at his forms, he doesn't deal with complex forms. He's got a standard form that the pieces go into. They get a little bigger or smaller. If you saw his very early work, there was much more of the sense of hand, interesting rims, a very different sensibility in the form. But in the last few years, it's about what he paints inside. So he's a painter using a bowl as his medium. And again, he also has that Membray's gift in that he can lift the image so that it becomes flat. And that all has to do with the way you curve a line and the rest of it. You have to create the illusion that that piece is flat and you can read the whole thing. In the beginning, Diego worked very much with traditional craft, with a few little freedoms that he took. But he used local clay. He copied the format of working with a puki, and the puki is a sort of little broken bowl, and it's how you begin to coil the pot. It creates the beginning of the coiling, and then you work on top of it. But he soon worked out that these pieces were very fragile. In fact, if they're not fired hard, if they're not fired hard enough, and you drip water on them, they melt. They come apart. So he was thinking of his legacy, which I'm really thrilled about, and he didn't want to lose his work to the inadequacies of the craft. And I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with my terminology, but at the end of the day, if you want to retain this into another era, into the next generations, it's very difficult to do it when you're working with such fragile material. So he began to work with commercial clays. He began to fire in a kiln, in a regular kiln, not doing wood fire. And because he wanted these pieces to survive, so that was fine. The technique of making the bowls, I think he's pretty much got together now. I guess he's made 5,000 of them by this point. So they arrive de facto. They are a certain shape and size. And he doesn't have to give attention to that, which has freed him up to do more with the painting, the surface painting inside. It can be problematic. A single hair from a brush that gets into a drawing can make that drawing more or less worthless. And he suffers from the same problems that all potters suffer from. Clay is unpredictable, and you buy it from the supplier today, and it works well, and you buy it from the supplier tomorrow, and they've made some little change to the clay that produces all kinds of problems. So he had, at one stage, a problem with pop-offs, which were these tiny little sections of clay would just become disconnected from the main form. And so there were these tiny little white dots that you could almost not notice. And so he had to work very hard to find slips that didn't do this. And I think for Diego, as much as for any other ceramist, that is a continuous thing, particularly if you try a new idea. It's not necessarily going to work the first time. So in that way, it's also not a traditional potter. The traditional potters have a very stable group of things that they do, and they've been doing it for decades, and they can pretty much produce it again and again. Because he takes chances, it often creates a problem, and then he has to sort it out. So the skill is, again, very much in the painting. He is just absolutely remarkable, and you never know what's going to come up next. One piece is essentially a cartoon that makes you want to laugh at someone's stupidity. It might be ours, it might be his, it might be his community. And then other pieces deal with extraordinary pain, human pain, the difficulty of relationships, and then also into issues of the environment and other concerns that he has. We had an exhibition that was coming to us, and it didn't arrive. So we started making inquiries, and we were told that they didn't know where Diego was, but a week before they had found his truck crashed into an arroyo, and he didn't make an appearance again for another 2 months. So at that stage, it was very difficult to work with him on a career. He was not operating with that kind of mindset. The other thing is that because of the way that native potters sell their work, which is they make it, they take it to a dealer, and the dealer pays them immediately for it. There was no concept of consignment. If they made something unusual and they took it to 3 dealers and 3 dealers said, I don't want to buy that, they would stop that area of investigation. So the market really pushed them back into what they made yesterday. That was the one pressure. The other pressure was what the white collectors mainly wanted from the artist. So it was very difficult. You know, in our gallery, we would go and see an artist preparing work for an exhibition. We would think it was the worst work they'd ever made. We would say nothing about it because an artist needs to have the occasional bad show. They need the freedom to make a mistake. And we would stay with them until it sorted out. But with the native potters, the moment a piece, a new thread they were developing, didn't find a market, within a week it was over. So it was difficult for them. When we started working with him, he still had no real idea of how an art gallery functioned. So yes, he would bring pieces and expect them to be purchased immediately. The thing we tried to avoid was the rent bowl. The rent bowl was made just before he had to pay his rent, and he did it quickly. It was not necessarily the most superb of his pieces, so we were very careful not to buy rent bowls. And then slowly he began to learn how to work in a more contemporary marketing sense, and that changed things quite a lot. So it's interesting how Diego, you know, first of all, he calls himself a half-breed. He's half white, half Cochiti. And he brings to the table the same thing, half of the issues of traditional native life and the freedoms from the more Europeanized aspect of what he does.